This crime against humanity was decided as early as 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, the British Crown, and Lord Rothschild of the Rothschild banking dynasty, otherwise known as the Bank of England, who, when it's all said and done, will have control over hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Palestinian oil and gas reserves. As Michael Rivero famously said, all wars are bankers' wars. According to Benjamin Franklin, the primary catalyst for the American Revolution was the Bank of England's Currency Act. After the Revolution, a value-based economy, with no interest being paid to any central bank, was created. But it didn't last long. The first Bank of the United States was chartered in 1791 and favored foreign stockholders over Americans. The charter ended in January of 1811, followed by the War of 1812, and the establishment of the Second Bank of the United States in 1816, which gave more power to the Bank of England. Andrew Jackson successfully killed the bank's renewal, and shortly after, became the first U.S. president targeted for assassination when Richard Lawrence drew pistols on him outside the U.S. Capitol, but misfired. Laws were passed in the early 1860s for the U.S. government to issue its own currency in a value-based economy as opposed to the debt-based system imposed by central banks. According to an 1864 edition of the London Times, this would have made America the wealthiest nation of the world. The article warned that if a government creates its own money, it will be without debt. It will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world, and therefore must be destroyed. In 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated, and the economy was quickly phased back to the central bank's debt enslavement model. In 1913, the tyrannical Federal Reserve Bank and federal income tax was born. The two world wars brought Germany under the heel of the central banking cartel. Western banking institutions financed the Bolshevik Revolution. In 2000, Iraq stopped selling its oil in Federal Reserve notes. In 2003, Iraq was illegally invaded by the United States, and dollar-based oil sales were reinstated. In Libya, Muammar Gaddafi's gold dinar currency was making the nation rich. In 2011, the U.S. invaded and reverted Libya's oil sales to dollars.
It's on you to protect yourself. That's why we trust and personally use Aura, today's sponsor. Aura does all the heavy lifting to keep you safe online. They take action against these data brokers and companies who are selling your personal information. Going after them directly, you don't have to lift a finger. Aura handles it. But that's not all. Here's where it gets even more serious. Aura doesn't just stop there. They continuously monitor the dark web for any trace of your personal data. If they find your information floating around in places it shouldn't be, Aura will alert you immediately. They'll let you know fast if anyone is trying to use that data to access your credit accounts or even drain bank accounts. And if the worst happens to you, Aura has you covered. They offer up to $5 million in identity theft insurance to help you recover if someone gets a hold of your information and tries to do real damage. Don't wait until it's too late. Head over to our link, aura.com/anonymous, to try Aura free for 14 days. That's plenty of time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data is exposed and start protecting you from these threats.
The Bank for International Settlements recently proposed efforts under the guise of anti-money laundering that would provide scores to tokens and digital wallets, including stablecoins. Digital ID, social credit scores, and a carbon tax is what the bankers are up to now. And everything else is a distraction. Today's war is mostly psychological, and it's being waged upon you.
BCCI was basically this bank that was set up as publicly as a development bank. It was about essentially banking the unbanked in the global south. That was sort of the framing of it. But in reality, that bank had been set up by the CIA, and it was involved in all sorts of things, including laundering profits for arms trafficking, drug trafficking. It came under scrutiny as part of the Iran-Contra scandal, and of course, it collapsed in 1991 and was the subject of a Senate report that I would encourage people to read because it is really quite scandalous. And it also revealed that they were not only doing, engaging in brazen financial crimes on behalf of intelligence agencies all over the world and also drug cartels, but they were also engaged in the sex trafficking of minors, specifically to patronize some elite families of the United Arab Emirates, and were taking prepubescent children to be abused by these people. That is in the Senate report, so that's literally not a conspiracy theory. It was written, it's an official Senate report based on official evidence brought before the Senate. Okay, so it's a very significant story. Almost no one remembers it because it was essentially covered up by William Barr when he was Attorney General the first time. And he was also, of course, engaged in pardoning and sort of washing away related scandals to BCCI, like the Promise Software scandal of the same era, and also Iran-Contra, all of that essentially happening in 1991. So a lot of people don't remember that history, unfortunately. So, and looking at an entity like Tether, I have argued in a series I co-wrote with my colleague Mark Goodwin called The Chain that you can find on my website, Unlimited Hangout, that one of the co-founders of Tether and some of the other people involved in early Tether appear to have significant intelligence ties. Some of them, like Brock Pierce, have ties to pedophilia scandals that happened in the early 2000s. Tether since then has come under fire for being not transparent about its reserves, among other things. And it has also been memory hold its role in the FTX scandal, where you had Alameda Research being very involved with, the Tether supply and helping it maintain its peg, among other things. And we, of course, know now that FTX was involved in all sorts of financial misconduct, for lack of a better word.
To put it nicely. Yeah.
Yes. And, Solana, which has been responsible for these pump and dump meme coins, among other things, was also very closely tied to Sam Bankman-Fried. He's been called one of the main reasons behind its rise in popularity, for what it since has become. And there's no shortage of examples of sort of pump and dump meme coins that have sort of rugged people of a lot of money, and what has that money ultimately led to, and who was ultimately responsible for that pump and dump rug pull, wealth transfer, arguably, type of operation. It definitely would facilitate this type of bad behavior that we know intelligence agencies have engaged in with the past, like the BCCI example. It would definitely facilitate that. And the fact that you have these types of connections there, I think is certainly worthy of examination. And Tether notably has a lot of the same rhetoric that BCCI once used, the idea of, banking the unbanked, for example. But they're very willing to seize people's money on behalf of the U.S. Treasury. And Paolo Arduino, who is the head of Tether now, has said that Tether is fully committed to expanding U.S. dollar hegemony globally, and has, onboarded the FBI and Secret Service on that platform. And that essentially makes it digital arm, you could argue, of the U.S. government. And when you also consider this military manual that was published by WikiLeaks, well over a decade ago, they referred to, basically the dollar and some of these style of financial institutions that help propagate it globally, particularly in the global south, as sort of financial weapons of U.S. empire. And it's very possible, and I think an argument can clearly be made that Tether is sort of facilitating that, specifically in economies that have become unstable or have very unstable currencies. And some of that is partly due to U.S. sanctions. Some of it is due to these entities that have been called financial weapons of U.S. empire, like the IMF and the World Bank. And then their currencies are unstable. They're covered trapped in this debt slavery model, which is a big reason in many cases, for a lot of the economic instability. And people are being onboarded onto the digital dollar, onto Tether, as a way to be able to preserve their wealth. But ultimately, it's kind of a way to globalize the dollar and covertly dollarize a country without formally dollarizing it, in the way that places like Ecuador and El Salvador were formally dollarized. And if you consider the outsized role, including in the digital digital asset space, and sort of its formation and the infrastructure for it of some of these currency speculators, and the role of currency speculators in the past, we can point to in the 90s, George Soros, or arguably people like, Jeffrey Epstein, if you're familiar with my work, having a role in, crushing local currencies. If that were to happen today, and there's no reason to think that type of currency speculation, like, Soros style in 92, for example, doesn't happen today, I'm sure it does, then the end result could easily be people just sort of onboarding to the dollar, particularly a form of the dollar that is surveillable, seizable, and ultimately programmable. And those were the same concerns that a lot of Americans have had about central bank digital currencies. It's not necessarily that the money would be issued by the central bank, because money is issued by the central bank now. It's about the concern that it presents to liberty because it's surveillable, programmable, and seizable. And I think Tether checks all of those boxes ultimately. And really any sort of digital dollar that the US ultimately approves, which is very likely in the Trump administration. At his speech at the Bitcoin conference last year, said no CBDCs, but was very bullish on stablecoins, on dollar stablecoins, which are a major purchaser of US treasuries, for example, and help service the US debt. And if you combine that with a lot of his bullishness on Bitcoin, the talks of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, for example, I think it's very possible that we could see this type of digital dollar paradigm that Tether really helped start expand. And I don't think there's really a lot of discussions about whether this is good or what the potential origins or intentions of it were or still are, because a lot of people that promote Tether have very rose-tinted glasses about it and parrot this idea of banking the unbanked and sort of ignore the FBI Secret Service connection, the fact that they've seized people's money when the U.S. Treasury Department has asked them to do that, even if they're not U.S. citizens, and this type of stuff. What is this ultimately? And I think people that are particularly in the Bitcoin space, which has often been sort of flooded at times with the opinion that Tether is a Bitcoin company, should consider that, especially when a lot of the rhetoric and ideology around Bitcoin was about stopping the debt slavery system and the debt-based monetary system. Do people really want to perpetuate that? And is it really conducive to financial freedom and banking the unbanked in a way that is good for liberty?
What do you think would happen if the U.S. did formalize a Bitcoin reserve and began purchasing that? Would that be good, bad, or indifferent for Bitcoin?
Well, I think it depends on your perspective about Bitcoin. I think a lot of people have, including in the Bitcoin space, have become very obsessed with the number go up mentality and are not really interested in the ideology that helped popularize it among certain demographics. And personally, I think my interest in Bitcoin, it's the only cryptocurrency that I see as really having any value. I mean, don't mean to swear, but everything else to me is pretty much a shit coin. I would say that it really depends on where things go from here and the extreme interest of, the traditional financial system and the US government, which the ideology of Bitcoin was opposed originally to working with those two entities and sought to, supplant them because, they are bad. That kind of is the original part of the original Bitcoin ethos that has been sort of shed in favor of mass adoption and the idea that holders of Bitcoin will become extremely wealthy, and the concern and the idea about having freedom money, privacy money, and all of that has sort of definitely taken a back burner and may disappear entirely from the discourse. I personally don't see that as positive. I think if we're going to move into the digital money space, and there's, this push to eliminate cash, I think anonymity and privacy is important. The argument is that, well, bad people use it to money launder and all of this stuff. And sure, that's true. But even if we go into a new digital system, I really doubt that the CIA and some of these other entities that engage in that same type of behavior will be forced to stop. I think it'll be money laundering for me and not for thee kind of thing. And also a lot of people that use those, privacy enhancing protocols and products aren't money launderers. They just don't like mass surveillance, which again was part of the, early ideology common among people in the Bitcoin space. And so, the idea that there was that it was going to challenge fiat and bring more financial fairness to the world and our debt-based monetary system and put us on a hard money standard and all of this, a lot of that has sort of gone out of the window. And the idea of, Bitcoin, sort of use it as a new petrodollar analog. You want to play with Bitcoin, you need dollars to get access to it. Essentially, this is is sort of the theory of my colleague Mark Goodwin, who wrote The Bitcoin Dollar, that I would really recommend for anyone that wants to see what's happening now, having been written about like 3 years ago by somebody. This is something that I think is very likely to happen. And I think, people that hold Bitcoin, that care about that ethos still, need to think about, if their bags get pumped, what will they do with that money to preserve financial freedom? Because I don't think the US government or, BlackRock or some of these other entities that have become very bullish on Bitcoin are interested in protecting privacy or having Bitcoin be used for freedom money necessarily. And so I think that stuff personally to me matters, and is one of the reasons that I've tried to speak to people in the Bitcoin space for some time, because I think a lot of those people do care about the ethos, but I think there is sort of an effort to flood the zone, if you will, with this idea that it doesn't matter anymore, and that we should sort of surrender that ethos in favor of becoming extremely wealthy. And that is going to be persuasive for a lot of people, especially when we're potentially facing a debt crisis and an economic downturn. And historically, that type of drastic wealth increase for people can be very persuasive and getting them to change their ideology. But I would argue that the direction the world is going, it's important to think about what we can do to preserve freedom. And, if you're expecting to have a major increase in your ability to finance things, maybe consider financing things that help ensure privacy and help ensure financial freedom, and ensure that Bitcoin could become freedom money and not just a strategic asset for a few very powerful people.
If you enjoyed today's video on Anonymous Official, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks for watching and sticking with us.